Chase Morgan never imagined that returning to the house he had once helped his brother build would become a declaration of war. Not with the city, not with any government entity, but with something far more insidious. A neighborhood alliance ruled by an aging woman named Karen, who wore her authority like a badge, or more accurately, a sledgehammer. After years of working in furniture restoration and architectural woodworking, Chase had finally decided to step away from contract deadlines and difficult clients and do something for himself. His brother, Derek, who had passed away 2 years prior from a stroke, had left him the property on Orchard Ridge Lane, a quiet street on the outer edges of town where well-kept lawns and plastic smiles hid layers of petty grievances and passive aggression. The house itself was nothing spectacular. 2 stories, with a weathered cedar exterior, moss creeping up the shingles, and a sagging porch that had once been the pride of Derek's craftsmanship. But to Chase, it wasn't just a project, it was a reclamation. He saw it as an opportunity to restore something with meaning, something connected to family, even if that family was now gone. He didn't want permits and big crews. He wanted to work by hand, with his own tools, alone, and without fanfare. That solitude, however, would prove impossible in a place like Orchard Ridge, where silence was suspect and independence was perceived as rebellion. On the first morning, he parked his dusty pickup on the driveway, unloaded his tools, and began walking the perimeter, making mental notes on repairs. Guttering, roofing, fascia rot, window seals, foundational shifts, and about a dozen other issues that made the house feel as if it were quietly asking to be saved. He barely noticed the woman watching him from across the street, arms folded over a pastel sweater draped over her shoulders, standing in the shadow of a magnolia tree. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and stood with the kind of planted authority one associates with traffic cops and angry school principals. Her name, as he would learn within 48 hours, was Karen Harris, and she was the chairwoman of the local property council, an unofficial but ruthlessly effective body of busybodies with real sway and zero accountability. Chase's first interaction with her was brief. She crossed the street and introduced herself in the form of a warning. "You'll want to make sure any changes to exterior structure comply with our residential guidelines. We have standards on paint color, roof pitch, siding materials, and tool storage visibility." Chase, who had a hammer looped through his belt and sawdust on his shirt from a morning of sanding interior beams, blinked slowly and said, "It's my house. I'll be restoring it to how my brother left it. That's all." She replied with a tight smile and a saccharine, "Oh, of course, I just thought I'd offer a friendly heads up." That might have been the end of it, or so Chase assumed, but the following days proved otherwise. A white sedan with tinted windows began appearing at odd hours, parked just down the block. A man stepped out once and took pictures of the house from across the street, pretending to check something on his phone when Chase approached. He didn't introduce himself, just nodded vaguely and got in the car. The air around Orchard Ridge had started to shift. Neighbors who used to wave now kept their greetings clipped and mechanical. One woman even crossed the street to avoid passing in front of his property, as if the renovation itself carried contagion. Still, Chase pressed on. He began with the roof, stripping off old shingles and laying out a new underlayment. He worked from morning to evening, shirtless in the heat, sweat and tar matting his arms, a man immersed in labor without apology. Every nail he drove into the beams felt like staking a claim. Every old plank he pulled free was an act of liberation. He installed a new ladder platform to work from, a tall, telescoping frame that he anchored firmly against the upper fascia. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid. It worked. That's when the real trouble began. Karen returned, this time standing directly under his ladder while he worked near the edge of the second story. "Mr. Morgan," she called up, "I've received complaints that your work is creating excessive noise and that your ladder is within visibility range of the road. That violates visual obstruction ordinances within the community design standards." Chase looked down at her, blinking sweat from his eyes. "That's because I'm working on a roof." "Where else should a ladder go?" he replied. She seemed unfazed. "Well, the design covenant suggests angled equipment should not be visible from the curb between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. unless screened. This includes ladders, scaffolds, and sawhorses." Chase stared at her, genuinely confused. "Are you serious?" he asked. "Deadly," she replied before turning and walking away without another word. That evening, Chase received a printed letter shoved under his front door. No envelope, no postmark. Just a single sheet of stiff, cream-colored paper with a list of supposed infractions, signed the Residential Standards Committee. It wasn't a legal document, it wasn't official, but it was meant to look like it was. He read it 3 times, each line more absurd than the last. Unpermitted visual disruption, unsanctioned material storage, and unauthorized tool display, as if his toolbox itself was some kind of public threat. Chase folded the letter and tossed it in the trash. Still, something in him shifted. This wasn't just irritation from a nosy neighbor. This was a warning shot, a soft push meant to gauge his response. He tightened the locks on the garage, began logging each interaction in a small notebook. He called a friend of his who worked in contracting law just to ask general questions about code enforcement and personal property rights. Nothing overt, just groundwork. But beneath his calm demeanor, Chase felt it growing, an instinctive, bone-deep alertness that came not from paranoia, but from experience. He had seen these types before, people who spoke in rules but acted in threats, people who used social systems like camouflage. On the morning of the 5th day, he arrived early and began working again on the roof ridge, kneeling on the platform and driving nails with the weight of a man trying to outrun escalation. The street was quiet. The wind hummed gently through the gutters. Birds flitted across wires. Then, without warning, the ladder wobbled, just slightly but enough to jolt his balance. He steadied himself, paused, and looked down. Karen was standing at the base again, only this time her hands were not folded. One hand was still extended, fingers just barely touching the ladder's base. Chase didn't think. He moved. In one motion, he shifted his weight, grabbed the metal support, and jumped. His boots hit the ground with a thud, knees absorbing the impact as he rose. He grabbed the ladder with both hands, twisted it upward, and slammed it sideways, trapping Karen against the wooden fence with one arm across her chest, not enough to hurt her, but enough to pin her. She gasped, not in pain, but with theatrical flair. "Assault!" she said breathlessly. "You just committed assault." Her face was flushed, not with fear, but with triumph. Chase realized it instantly. It was a setup. She had touched the ladder on purpose. She had wanted a reaction, and he had given her one. For a moment, neither moved. A car rolled by in the distance. The wind kicked up a small spiral of dust. Chase's eyes didn't blink, didn't drop. He leaned forward and said, low and even, "Don't ever touch my gear again." Then he stepped back, dropped the ladder gently to the ground, and walked away. Karen straightened her blouse, then pulled out her phone and began dialing, smiling like she'd just won a prize. Chase didn't wait to see what happened next. He walked to the front porch, sat down on the steps, and stared at the hammer in his hand. He didn't know what was coming yet, but he knew something had changed. The house was no longer just a home. It had become a front line, and Karen Harris wasn't just a neighbor. She was an enemy who knew how to fight in ways that didn't require weapons, only pressure, perception, and patience. And Chase, though he didn't know it yet, was about to learn just how far she'd go. The call came that evening, just as the last amber light was bleeding out of the sky, and Chase had finished locking away his tools. It wasn't Karen on the line. He would have recognized that shrill composure instantly. It was a deputy from the county station, Officer Leary, whose tone managed to sound both routine and vaguely accusatory at once. The message was clear. There had been a complaint of physical aggression involving Chase and a neighbor, and while no charges had been filed yet, he was being advised to expect a follow-up interview. Leary added that the neighbor had visible bruising and claimed to feel unsafe due to Chase's hostile temperament. Chase didn't argue. He just said, "I'll cooperate," and hung up. There was nothing more to say. The game had officially begun. The next morning, he awoke to find a folded notice pinned to the porch rail with a piece of painter's tape. It wasn't from law enforcement. It was from the neighborhood committee, bearing the header, "Urgent Community Notice, Ordinance Violation Alert." In neat, cold print, it claimed Chase's ongoing construction violated several local property codes, including unapproved roofing, materials, noise pollution, and use of unsanctioned ladders that exceeded safe height limits without posted warning signage. At the bottom, the notice demanded voluntary suspension of all exterior activity pending review, with the signature of the Property Oversight Board's president, Karen Harris. Chase stared at the paper for a moment, then walked inside and opened a drawer. He pulled out the certified copies of his building permits, the photos from his roofing supplier showing material compliance, and the form submitted to the county office weeks before his work began. Everything was legal. Everything had been filed. Karen's notice was nothing more than an intimidation tactic, meant not to correct a violation, but to fabricate one. Still, the implications weren't small. For the average neighbor, it would create hesitation, doubt, maybe enough to halt the work and avoid conflict. But Chase wasn't average. He wasn't new to conflict. He knew how cowards operated. They didn't kick in the front door. They pulled the foundation out from under you, slow and silent. Around noon, while unloading new insulation boards from the back of his truck, he noticed two men parked across the street in a dark blue van. They wore work shirts but made no move to approach. One of them sat in the driver's seat scrolling on a tablet. The other occasionally looked up through aviator sunglasses, pretending to observe the trees. Chase wasn't paranoid. He was observant. That van hadn't been there before, and their uniforms didn't match any utility service he recognized. He walked into the house, grabbed a pair of binoculars from a shelf, and went out onto the second-floor landing. Through the lens, he spotted a badge on the shoulder of one shirt. Metro Community Services, External Review Division. It sounded made up. No such agency had jurisdiction here unless requested by the city itself, and the city didn't initiate unscheduled reviews without homeowner requests or code violations, neither of which applied to Chase. Within an hour, the van drove off. By evening, a drone hovered briefly above his backyard, dipping just low enough to draw attention before zipping back into the sky. That night, he covered his ladders with tarps and parked his truck closer to the fence line. He double-checked the locks on his tool shed, switched out the batteries on the trail cams he had set around the yard, and started keeping a small voice recorder in his pocket. 3 days later, Chase received a letter in a plain white envelope, no return address, slipped under his front door like a threat. Inside was a copy of a petition. It bore 15 names, neighbors he barely knew, people who had once waved to him or nodded in passing. The petition accused Chase of creating an unfriendly environment, operating commercial-scale equipment without approval, and violating the quiet character of the block. It demanded a formal hearing with the Oversight Board. The tone was unmistakably legalistic, though none of it had any legal weight. It was theater, dressed up in procedure, soaked in bureaucracy. Chase read every name carefully. Only 2 rang familiar. The rest, he realized, had likely signed without question, nudged by Karen's smiling coercion. The following morning, he found a bright orange stake driven into the edge of his front yard. Attached was a laminated tag. Pending evaluation, infrastructure review. Chase stood over it for a moment, then yanked it out of the ground and tossed it onto the porch. He had had enough. He called his friend Jason, a municipal lawyer with experience dealing with zoning harassment. Chase laid it all out, every visit, every note, every mysterious inspection. Jason listened quietly, then asked, "Did you file a paper trail when you submitted your plans?" "Yes," Chase said. "Everything's dated and stamped." "Good," Jason replied. "Because if they're trying to force an enforcement hearing, you're going to want every shred of legitimacy on your side. These people don't care about right or wrong. They care about wear-down tactics. You're a variable they don't control, and that terrifies them." Over the next week, Chase noticed subtle changes. Garbage collection skipped his address twice in a row, despite calls to the sanitation department. Packages began arriving late, or not at all. A local delivery driver he'd known for years told him with a frown. They called the depot, said you've been flagged for special routing due to ongoing safety issues on the property. When he asked who they were, the driver just shrugged. Then came the call from his insurance adjuster. Someone had filed a complaint claiming unsafe conditions at the house. Unsecured ladders, exposed nails, children seen near open wiring. The adjuster hadn't taken it seriously, but he had to file a report to meet protocol. "It's probably nothing," he said. But Chase heard the unease in his voice. Even a dropped policy, he knew, wouldn't stop him, but it would slow him down. Delay was their weapon. Confusion, doubt, fatigue. All of it served the same goal. The final blow came quietly. On a Wednesday afternoon, Chase returned from the hardware store and found a note taped to the front door. This one bore the county seal. It wasn't a fake, it was real. The notice was signed by a compliance officer, indicating that his property had been selected for a special use review, due to multiple neighbor complaints about unapproved construction, noise violations, and potential encroachment on shared green space. Chase felt his pulse quicken. Shared green space? His property didn't border any shared lots. There were no communal walkways, no public easements, not even an alley. It was a blatant fabrication. But with enough letters, enough complaints, it didn't have to be real to become a problem. He immediately called Jason again, who listened carefully and said, "This isn't a misunderstanding anymore. It's a coordinated escalation. They're going to try and get you classified as non-compliant with neighborhood zoning so they can issue a cease order. We need to move fast." That evening, Chase sat on his porch, staring across the street at Karen's house. Her lights were on. The glow from the kitchen window showed her moving about in a floral housecoat, humming some old melody as she stirred a pot on the stove. The image was grotesquely normal, domestic, serene. But he knew better. Behind that smile, behind that quaint aesthetic, was a campaign of precision sabotage. She wasn't just trying to get rid of him. She was trying to make him quit. Not through violence, not through threats, through systems, through paper, through smiling neighbors with empty eyes and manufactured outrage. For the first time, Chase realized this wasn't going to be solved by talking, by compromise, or by hoping it would blow over. It had already gone too far. The tools he needed now weren't in his shed. They were in court filings, documented statements, and calls to city officials who could still tell the difference between procedure and persecution. As the streetlights flickered on and the neighborhood settled into its evening hush, Chase got up, went inside, and began preparing for what would come next. He wasn't just repairing a house anymore, he was defending it. And from this point forward, every step he took would be measured, strategic, and deliberate. Because now, he understood one crucial truth. Karen didn't want to win a dispute. She wanted to erase his presence entirely, and he had no intention of making that easy. 3 days after the county notice appeared on his door, Chase received a knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps, not tentative like a neighbor's, but not forceful enough to be a warrant-bearing officer either. He opened the door to find a man and a woman standing on his porch in slate-gray business attire, holding clipboards and wearing ID badges with a barely legible agency name that seemed more administrative than governmental. The man introduced himself as Mr. Lanning, the woman as Ms. Farrow, both representing the Regional Property Standards Advisory Panel. Chase immediately clocked the absurdity. Such panels didn't typically send field agents without warning. "We're conducting an evaluative site visit," Lanning said flatly, already stepping forward as if invited. "We're aware of an open file involving potential non-compliance issues with outdoor installations and environmental setbacks." Chase didn't move, forcing them to pause. "I wasn't notified of a visit." "That's required, isn't it?" he asked calmly. The woman offered a tight smile and said, "In most cases, yes, but under expedited review protocols, unannounced visits are permitted. It's all covered under Provision 16C of the Municipal Property Harmony Act." Chase blinked. That wasn't a real ordinance. He knew the codes well enough to recognize jargon dressed as legitimacy. He didn't let them in. Instead, he stepped outside, shut the door behind him, and stood on the porch, arms crossed. "You're welcome to walk the exterior," he said, "but you're not stepping inside without a warrant." Lanning gave the briefest pause before nodding. "Of course," he said, and they began circling the property, murmuring notes to one another while taking photos of everything from the angle of his rain gutters to the slope of his driveway. Chase followed, silent, watching them more than they watched the house. When they finished, they handed him a summary sheet, a generic form letter filled with vague phrases like "discrepancy noted" and "further action may be required." Then they left as abruptly as they had come. Within 48 hours, Chase's mailbox was filled with flyers from neighborhood safety committees, urging residents to be vigilant about unauthorized construction that could endanger local youth and disrupt the visual integrity of our block. Some bore no return address, others were signed by concerned citizens of Orchard Ridge, a name he'd never heard before. One particularly inflammatory sheet included a blurred photo of his backyard taken at night with the words, "Do you know what's going on next door?" printed in bold red across the top. It was propaganda, crude but effective, and Chase felt the shift in atmosphere when he walked down the street. No one made eye contact. Conversation stopped when he passed. His presence had become radioactive. That weekend, he returned home from the lumberyard to find his front gate chain-wrapped and locked with a padlock that wasn't his. A sign hung on the fence reading, "Pending structural review. Entry prohibited." He cut it with bolt cutters and filed a police report. The responding officer, a young guy named Torres, seemed uncomfortable even writing it up. "You're not the first person on this street to deal with weird interference," Torres admitted under his breath. "But every time we push, the story changes. It gets called a miscommunication, a clerical error, a misunderstanding. No one ever claims responsibility." Chase asked him if he'd had complaints about this neighborhood before. "Oh, Torres just said, there's a reason nobody wants to patrol this stretch more than once a month." It wasn't long after that incident that Chase's contractor, an old friend who was scheduled to help install the ridge vents, called to cancel. "I got a visit," he said, voice low. "Some lady said if I did any more work on your place, I'd lose my standing with the county permit board. She didn't threaten directly, but she knew my license number and my wife's name." Chase asked if he got her name. "Just Karen," the friend replied. "Didn't think I needed a last name." From that point on, labor became harder to secure. Calls went unanswered. Quotes evaporated. Delivery trucks delayed orders for inexplicable reasons, claiming rerouting protocols or missing gate codes. One morning, Chase woke up to find every garbage can on his property overturned. Not just knocked over, but gutted. Bags sliced open, contents smeared across his front walk like a warning. In the center of the mess sat a plastic yardstake with a smiley face sticker and the words, "Stay compliant," scrawled in Sharpie. That afternoon, a woman from the Department of Environmental Quality knocked on his door. She had received an anonymous tip about chemical runoff leaking from a storage shed on the property. Chase led her around back and opened the shed himself. It contained nothing but sealed bags of mulch and a stack of unused roof panels. The woman apologized, clearly embarrassed. "We've had a surge in reports lately," she admitted. "Almost all false alarms, but we're required to follow up." He nodded. He wasn't angry at her, just tired. By this point, Chase had documented every incident in meticulous detail. He kept a private log, stored backup photos in cloud folders, and began forwarding everything to his attorney, Jason, who started assembling what he called a pattern of malice. Jason was confident they could build a harassment case if it continued, but advised Chase to be careful. "These kinds of campaigns escalate when they lose traction," he warned. "They start with notices, then come the violations, then sabotage. The goal is to exhaust you until you either sell or snap." That prediction proved too accurate. The next escalation came on a Sunday, just before dawn. Chase heard a dull clatter outside and opened his front door to find someone had driven long nails into the tires of his truck. Not slashed them. Driven industrial roofing nails directly into the treads. 4 punctures, all even, all deliberate. He checked the camera feed, but the figure had stayed in the tree line, face hidden, movements practiced. Jason advised filing a formal complaint. The sheriff's office took it down but showed little interest in investigating. "Unless you've got a clear plate or facial ID, it's not going anywhere," the deputy had said. "And even if you did, it'd likely be filed under property dispute unless you had a restraining order." So Chase filed for one. The paperwork was dense, the process slow, but the hearing was scheduled. He listed Karen Harris by name and cited over a dozen separate incidents, including photographic and physical evidence. He didn't expect it to go through. Judges rarely issued orders without overt threats, but it was enough to get it on record. That, Jason said, was half the battle. Meanwhile, the neighbor to the left of Chase, a man named Bill who had previously kept to himself, began speaking up. "You're not crazy," he said one morning while the two stood by the edge of the yard. "They tried the same thing with the Clarks. Drove them out in 6 months. Paperwork, accusations, even called child services on them. And their kid was 2 years old." When Chase asked why Bill hadn't said anything sooner, he shrugged. "Didn't think I could help. Still don't. But I figured you ought to know they've done it before. And they'll keep doing it until someone costs them something." That night, Chase didn't sleep. He sat by the upstairs window, watching the street, every shadow a potential threat, every noise a trigger, not from fear, but from the pressure of being hunted in plain sight, not by criminals or thugs, but by people who wore cardigans and served on neighborhood boards, who weaponized forms and fine print. He had underestimated the power of suburban politics, the slow poison of polite warfare. The house groaned under the wind. Somewhere down the block, a motion light flicked on and off. The world outside looked normal, quiet, tame. But Chase knew better now. The fight wasn't on the roof or at the fence. It was in meetings he wasn't invited to, in calls he wasn't meant to hear, in signatures gathered not out of belief but exhaustion. The first strike had been symbolic. The latter, everything since, had been tactical. The difference now was Chase had stopped reacting. He was preparing. And no matter how many smiling notices came, he had no intention of giving up even an inch. By the end of the second week, the pressure had evolved into something more systemic, less improvisational and erratic, and now increasingly coordinated, as if the campaign against Chase had moved from emotional harassment to procedural entrapment. On a gray Tuesday morning that smelled faintly of rain and fresh concrete, an official envelope from the county zoning office appeared in his mailbox. Inside was a summons. Not a legal charge, but a formal invitation to appear at a neighborhood compliance review panel scheduled at the Community Civic Center, with attendance listed as mandatory, due to multiple unresolved violations pending. Residential status classification. Chase didn't need a lawyer to recognize the trap. If he failed to appear, they'd cite non-compliance. If he did appear, they'd turn the proceeding into a circus of falsehoods and public opinion disguised as due process. Still, not attending would give them more fuel. And so, dressed in a pressed collared shirt and carrying a black binder filled with copies of permits, affidavits, contractor correspondence, and legal notifications, Chase entered the municipal building at 10:02 a.m. Inside, a long rectangular room had been arranged with folding chairs, a podium, and a faux wood conference table behind which sat 6 people, none of them city officials. At the center, naturally, was Karen Harris, wearing an ivory blazer over a powder blue blouse and a brooch shaped like a dove, her silver-gray hair coiled perfectly above her thin, pressed mouth. Beside her sat 2 men and 3 women, all nodding solemnly as Chase was directed to the front of the room. There was no court stenographer, no legal oversight, only a volunteer with a pen and legal pad pretending to record minutes. Chase stood with his binder and offered no greeting. Karen was the first to speak, adopting the tone of someone who imagines herself a diplomat. Measured, vaguely condescending, and always just short of accusatory. "Mr. Morgan," she began, "we're gathered here today to resolve growing concerns regarding your construction activity, property maintenance, and interactions with fellow residents. It is our hope that a mutually agreeable resolution can be reached today." Chase said nothing, waiting for the real purpose of the meeting to uncoil from her tongue like a rope soaked in honey. Multiple complaints have been filed regarding visual obstructions, construction noise, exterior modifications incompatible with our neighborhood's architectural language, and alleged confrontations with residents, including an incident where physical aggression was reported. "We are not here to litigate, of course," she added, her tone patronizing, "but we are obligated to ensure that Orchard Ridge remains a peaceful and consistent living environment for all." Chase opened his binder and laid several documents on the podium one by one. Permit approvals, construction timelines, city correspondence, contractor certifications, and, finally, a notarized statement from the city permit office verifying that all registered activity on his property fell within the legal boundaries of homeowner discretion. "All of this," he said, voice low but steady, "demonstrates that my work is permitted, my materials are compliant, and no legal violations exist under municipal code. What remains are grievances without legal basis, preferences, not policy." Karen smiled without teeth. "We appreciate your preparedness," she replied, "but even fully permitted activity must exist in harmony with the spirit of community cohesion. And when residents feel threatened, whether legally justified or not, we have a duty to act in the interest of the neighborhood as a whole." The word spirit clung in the air like smoke. Chase stared at her, realizing she wasn't just hoping to pressure him, she was trying to redefine the framework altogether. If the legal route failed, she would pivot to emotional arguments dressed in official vocabulary. Then came the escalation. A middle-aged woman in a gray pantsuit stood and introduced herself as a concerned neighbor. She claimed to have witnessed Chase yelling at a delivery driver and suggested he might be harboring unsafe materials. Another man, older, claimed his dog became agitated whenever it neared Chase's property, implying a potential chemical hazard. It was all coordinated, thinly veiled, exaggerated, and impossible to disprove. Chase could feel the noose tightening, not because of guilt, but because of the sheer theatricality of the setting, the performance that needed no truth to succeed, only consensus. He countered with logic, calmly referencing inspection logs and independent observations, but each rebuttal only seemed to fuel the panel's quiet disdain. Then, without warning, Bill, his quiet neighbor who had until then remained out of sight, stood up from a seat in the rear corner. He wasn't on the agenda. He hadn't been invited. But with the measured calm of someone who had nothing left to lose, he said, "I've lived on that block 27 years. That man hasn't done anything wrong. You people just don't like that he doesn't play your game." Karen turned toward him, her lips thinning, but Bill continued. "You think I didn't notice what you pulled with the Clarks? Or the old woman on Hollister who suddenly violated parking ordinances until she sold and disappeared? I kept quiet, but not this time." A few heads turned. The silence was brittle. Karen managed a tight nod and said, "This is not a public hearing, but the damage had been done. Someone had broken the illusion that the panel spoke for everyone." Chase didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply collected his documents, looked Karen dead in the eye, and said, "This was never about rules. This is about control, and I don't bend easy." Then he walked out. That evening, Jason called with good news. The formal complaint Chase had filed with the City Ethics Board had triggered a preliminary inquiry. Not into him, but into the Neighborhood Committee. An external agency had requested documentation for all internal petitions, votes, and procedural decisions. If the board had fabricated consent forms or misrepresented authority, it would no longer be a community matter. It would be criminal. The investigation wouldn't be fast, but it had begun. For the first time in weeks, Chase slept with the window open and the lights off. The wind outside smelled clean again. The war wasn't over, but he'd finally made them bleed. It began subtly, as these things always do when malice decides to cloak itself in procedure. A week after the ethics inquiry had been opened, Chase received a certified envelope from the city assessor's office. Inside was a formal notice of reassessment. According to the letter, a recent structural review of his property indicated an increase in taxable value due to unreported improvements. The listed upgrades included luxury exterior materials, custom security installations, and a non-existent detached garage. All fabrications, but skillfully written to sound like plausible enhancements to a home undergoing legitimate renovation. The change would more than double his property tax burden if it stood unchallenged. Chase didn't panic, but he felt the timing like a blade slipped quietly between the ribs. They weren't backing down, they were escalating, and now they were reaching for the only pressure point most working people fear more than legal. Trouble, financial collapse. He called Jason immediately. The lawyer sighed when he read the scanned document. "They're using the assessor's office as a back channel," he said. "Someone submitted an anonymous improvement report. It triggers an automatic reassessment unless contested within 30 days. That's their play now. Drown you in time-sensitive complications while they try to strip you dry. They know you can't pause your life to fight every corner at once." But Chase could, and he would. He submitted a formal challenge, demanded a site visit, and scheduled an inspection where he personally walked the assessor through the property, pointing to every exposed beam, every unfinished wall, every piece of rotting siding. The man looked uncomfortable, almost apologetic as he scribbled in his clipboard. "I'll adjust it," he said. "It's clear this isn't what was described." But the very next day, a new letter arrived, this time from the Department of Environmental Risk Management. According to their records, an anonymous source had reported that Chase's backyard renovation might involve illegal runoff from staining chemicals and pressure-treated wood, which, if true, could represent a Class C water contamination violation. Chase didn't even use those materials. But now he had to produce receipts, supplier statements, and chemical content documentation for every product he'd used in the past month. And while he scrambled to collect every invoice and code stamp, his project ground to a halt, because any further work could be interpreted as tampering with the ongoing site investigation. Then came the community board's next move. Quiet, but precise. Late one afternoon, he received a letter from a private legal firm representing a subdivision developer. According to their claim, the Crescent Living Group had entered into a pre-zoning contract with the city to acquire parcels along the north border of Orchard Ridge, including, they asserted, adjacent tracts whose formal designation remains under dispute. His property, they claimed, rested partially on land that had been historically filed as unincorporated and therefore could be subjected to reclassification under new development incentives. It was legal nonsense, a speculative land grab, but the firm had included a map marked with proposed lot divisions and a courtesy offer to purchase the home outright for 70% of its estimated value, contingent upon immediate surrender of title and termination of residence. Chase didn't respond to the letter. Instead, he took it, along with the reassessment notice and the environmental complaint, and drove directly to Jason's office. "This isn't about me anymore," he said, laying out the documents. "This is coordinated asset pressure, lawfare. They're trying to force a surrender through fabricated complications, all traced back to a network of influence inside this community and its affiliates." Jason agreed. "I've seen this before," he said. "It's not common, but when you have a rogue board and a predatory developer working together, they target outliers, especially those who refuse to sell. They start soft, then they turn up the heat until the owner either gives up or goes broke trying to defend a home they can't improve, insure, or sell." They began formal countermeasures, motions to subpoena communications between the board and the developer's firm, discovery requests aimed at exposing how the complaints had been bundled and sent through city channels, and a request to pause any further regulatory filings affecting the property pending resolution of the ethics complaint. But Karen wasn't done. If anything, she was growing bolder. 2 days later, a group of neighbors appeared outside his property, led by her and flanked by 2 men who looked more like private security than homeowners. They held clipboards and wore polo shirts with subtle gold insignias, a leaf with an encircled O in the center. One carried a measuring wheel. Chase watched them from his porch. Karen didn't look up at him. She simply walked the sidewalk perimeter while her companions made notes and flagged locations with small plastic stakes. When Chase approached and asked what they were doing, Karen replied, "Just verifying lot lines. There have been some complaints about encroachments onto community-maintained property. If you've been placing materials beyond your survey line, it could become a legal matter." Chase responded by retrieving his certified boundary map and placing a printed copy into her hand. "These are the lines. You step past them again, and you'll be trespassing." That night, someone smashed 2 landscape lights on the edge of his yard. No cameras caught it. There were no footprints. But it felt like a warning, petty but precise. The following morning, a vehicle with government plates parked across from his home. A man stepped out, snapped a few pictures of the house, and drove off. No interaction, no explanation. It didn't matter who sent him. Chase was no longer dealing with a neighbor dispute. He was in a siege. Then came the turning point. One morning, just before sunrise, Chase was outside clearing debris when he noticed movement near his back fence. He approached quietly and saw someone crouching near the shed. When he called out, the figure bolted. Chase gave chase and managed to grab the back of the intruder's jacket as they tried to slip through a gap in the fence. The man twisted free and fled, leaving behind a small duffel bag. Inside were gloves, a small plastic container with a corrosive label, and a bundle of plastic ties. Chase stared at it in silence. This was no protest. This was sabotage. And perhaps worse. He contacted the sheriff's department and turned over the bag. This time, they took it seriously. A detective arrived, took a full statement, and promised to follow up. For the first time, Chase saw someone write down the name Karen Harris without smirking. The detective asked for any footage. Chase provided what little he had: motion blur at the corner of the property, partial silhouette, nothing definitive. But the detective's demeanor changed. "You've got something," he said. "Even if it's circumstantial, this bag crosses a line. And if we can prove connection, attempted property damage or worse, we're not talking citations anymore. We're talking charges. That night, Chase got a call from Bill. The older man spoke softly. "I heard about what happened. Be careful. When people like her feel cornered, they don't get reasonable. They get desperate." Chase didn't ask how he knew. He just said, "I'm not the one who needs to be afraid anymore." By the end of the week, Jason filed a formal motion requesting an injunction against any new regulatory action on Chase's property pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. The court granted a temporary hold, giving them 30 days of breathing room. 30 days to gather more, build pressure, and expose what had been hiding behind committee minutes and fake ordinances. But Chase didn't rest. He hardened his perimeter, increased surveillance, and began documenting every face, every interaction, every subtle shift in routine. He knew what was coming next wasn't a letter or a knock. It would be a final attempt to either break him or bury him. And he would be ready. The silence before the next strike was more menacing than any escalation that had come before. For nearly a week, nothing happened. No anonymous letters, no new inspections, no surprise visitors with clipboards or veiled threats disguised as neighborhood outreach. The phone didn't ring. The mailbox contained only utility bills and supermarket flyers. It felt wrong, like a predator holding its breath before lunging. Chase used the lull to reinforce his perimeter even further. He repositioned cameras, replaced sensor batteries, reinforced gate locks, and even added a motion-triggered floodlight system along the back fence line. He didn't tell anyone, not Jason, not Bill, that he was preparing for something he couldn't name yet but could feel, crawling just beneath the veneer of suburban peace like heat behind a wall before it bursts into flame. The quiet snapped at 3:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning. Chase was awake. He hadn't been sleeping much, and he heard the distant pop of something metallic followed by the unmistakable whir of a cordless tool. He moved silently, already dressed, and slipped out the back door, keeping to the shadows as he circled the house. At the far end of the yard, two men were crouched near the foundation. One of them prying at something with a crowbar, the other fumbling with wires emerging from a hole in the siding. Chase didn't hesitate. He crossed the yard swiftly, using the blind spot between the sensor cones to get within 10 feet before stepping fully into view. The beam of his flashlight snapped on, blinding them both, and in the same breath his voice came, calm and flat. "Drop it. Now." The man with the crowbar turned too quickly, slipped, and hit the ground with a thud, the tool clattering beside him. The other stood frozen, one hand still inside the wall. "You don't want to do this," Chase said, stepping closer, the flashlight now trained at chest height. "Because if you do, it won't go the way you think." The second man slowly pulled his hand free and raised both arms. "We were just following an order," he said, not defiant, defeated. "She told us it was cleared." Chase's jaw tightened. "Who?" he demanded, though he already knew. The man looked away. Chase grabbed his phone and snapped a photo of both faces in the harsh light. "Leave. Tell her I have your names in this photo. The next time, I press charges, and I won't be the one doing the talking." They ran. The next morning, Chase forwarded the images and a full report to the sheriff's department and Jason. Within an hour, the detective assigned to his case called to confirm that both men matched descriptions from another recent file involving sabotage at a property further north, in a zoning dispute eerily similar to Chase's. One of them had the prior charges that had been dropped for lack of evidence, and another still had an open fine for unlicensed contracting work. "They're part of a cleanup crew," the detective said. "Not official, not legal. Just useful when someone wants plausible deniability and doesn't want fingerprints on the lever." The detective requested a full walkthrough of the property, and Chase agreed. For the first time, law enforcement was taking this seriously, and not just as a neighborhood squabble. This was now a coordinated harassment case with criminal elements, and the investigation was being fast-tracked due to the increasing evidence of intent to damage and provoke. But the turning point came the next day. Not from the police, not even from Karen, but from inside the very system that had been used to batter him. A member of the neighborhood committee, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s named Darlene, who had always kept to herself during past events, arrived at Chase's doorstep with a manila folder and eyes filled with something like quiet resolve. She didn't ask to come in. She just handed him the folder and said, "I didn't sign up for this. None of us did. You should see this." Inside were photocopies, meeting notes, emails, printed texts, and unsigned forms, all pointing to one thing. Karen had been forging consent documents, filing petitions in residents' names without their knowledge, and misrepresenting committee votes to city offices by submitting falsified records. One email in particular stood out. It was from Karen to a developer contact referencing softening the resistance on Orchard's Edge and promising she would handle the last holdout personally. Chase read it twice, then looked up at Darlene. "Why now?" he asked. She shrugged, tears close to the surface. "Because it's gone too far. This isn't about rules anymore. It's about hurting people. And I won't be a part of that." Jason filed a motion the same day to include the new evidence into the ethics complaint, while the sheriff's office officially opened a criminal fraud investigation. Within 72 hours, Karen was served with a notice of inquiry and subpoena for her communications as acting board president. Her carefully curated veneer began to fracture publicly. The once friendly neighbors who had stood beside her now looked away as she passed. Some even started coming to Chase to apologize, not for what they had done, but for what they had allowed to happen through silence. The culmination came at the next public community hearing, where Karen attempted to maintain her position with a brittle smile and a practiced speech about integrity and protecting the legacy of our neighborhood. But this time, the crowd wasn't nodding along. They were listening, they were watching. And when the sheriff's investigator stood to confirm the investigation into fraudulent filings, falsified complaints, and collusion with external parties seeking to exploit zoning vulnerabilities, the silence in the room was deafening. Karen tried to interrupt, but her voice cracked. She reached for her papers, her prepared statements, her control, and found nothing solid to grip. Chase didn't say much that night. He didn't need to. His presence said everything. He stood, arms crossed, as Karen was formally suspended from her position pending investigation and escorted from the room by 2 deputies. Not arrested, not yet, but visibly removed from the seat of her power. The crowd parted like water. No one helped her gather her things. No one met her eye. She exited alone. Outside, the air was sharp with late spring wind. Chase paused before stepping into his truck. Bill caught up to him, putting a hand on his shoulder. "You held," he said simply. "Not many do." Chase nodded once, not out of pride, but out of exhaustion. The house behind him was still unfinished. The work was far from over. But now it was his again, uncontested, unthreatened, and undeniable. That night, for the first time in months, he turned off the alarms and slept. In the weeks following Karen's public fall from grace, the neighborhood underwent a slow, almost reluctant transformation. Not loud, not celebratory, but a quiet rearrangement of behaviors as if the entire street had exhaled for the first time in years and was unsure what to do with the air. The banners of compliance disappeared from windows. The self-appointed patrols stopped making their morning rounds. Neighbors who had once pretended not to see Chase now offered nods or a curt greeting. Not quite friendly, but not hostile either. A truce of sorts, born not from alliance, but from recognition. The balance of power had shifted, and those who once clung to the rules out of fear now seemed to regard them as optional, if not faintly embarrassing. The committee Karen had ruled with bureaucratic precision tried to reconvene once more, but without her sharp voice to guide them, and with several members resigning quietly in the aftermath of the investigation, they found themselves sitting in a half-empty meeting room, unsure who had the authority to call for a vote or what they were even voting on. Eventually, they dissolved it altogether, citing a need for re-evaluation of community leadership models in a 2-sentence statement posted near the mailboxes. It wasn't an apology, but it was close enough to an admission for people like them. As for Karen herself, she vanished from the neighborhood without fanfare. One morning, a moving truck appeared in her driveway. By nightfall, the curtains were drawn, the lights dark, and her car gone. No goodbye, no for sale sign, no forwarding address. Some said she left the city entirely, retreating to family in another state. Others claimed she took a deal in exchange for avoiding criminal charges, cooperation in exposing the developers she had aligned herself with. Chase didn't care where she went. Her absence was enough. The threat had been neutralized, not through vengeance or violence, but through the slow, grinding weight of accountability, exposed one forged document at a time. He didn't celebrate. He didn't call friends or throw a party or make a speech. Instead, he returned to work. The final shingles went onto the roof within days. He resealed the siding, rebuilt the porch railing by hand, and restored the house with the same deliberate care he had started with months ago, only now without the background hum of threat and resistance. With each nailed board, each layer of paint, the place became not just structurally sound, but emotionally reclaimed. It no longer felt like a contested zone. It felt like home. He took the tarps off his tools. He stopped locking the gate during the day. The cameras remained, but they were no longer a necessity, just precaution, like a fire extinguisher, something you hope to never use again, but keep within reach all the same. Neighbors began to visit, slowly, cautiously. One brought over a pie, explaining with visible discomfort that she hadn't really understood what was happening before, and she was just trying to stay out of things. Chase accepted it with a nod, not forgiving, but not cruel either. Another neighbor offered to help him trim the overgrowth near the fence as a gesture. Bill, who had been the only one to speak publicly during the fake hearing, became a quiet presence, dropping off tools, offering advice, sharing beer on warm evenings with no need for conversation. It wasn't community in the traditional sense, but it was something closer to decency, and that was more than enough. One afternoon, Chase received a letter from the city. It was not a summons nor a complaint, but a formal notice that the ethics board had ruled in favor of his complaint, citing multiple violations of procedural integrity and abuse of community authority by the former neighborhood committee leadership. While no criminal charges would be pursued directly, much to Jason's visible frustration, the board agreed that Chase's actions had been justified, his permits valid, and his resistance not only appropriate but necessary. The final line read, "The city thanks you for your cooperation and perseverance during this process." Chase laughed when he read it. It sounded like a badge, a thank you note from the machine that almost crushed him. The remaining developer interest in the area seemed to evaporate once the investigation documents were released publicly. Whatever had been promised to them, quiet compliance, cleared property lines, expedited zoning, was no longer available. With Karen gone and the neighborhood now wary of external interference, the so-called Crescent Living Group withdrew their filings, claiming in a public memo that current market conditions no longer support the viability of suburban expansion. In Orchard Ridge. No one believed that, of course, but no one argued with it either. The game had ended. There was nothing left to win. In the evenings, Chase sometimes sat on the porch and watched the sunset burn low over the rooftops, his coffee cooling in one hand, a quiet stillness wrapping around the property like the edge of a clean breath. The wind moved through the trees without whispering threat. The air no longer carried tension. The house, once surrounded by invisible lines of confrontation, now stood open, quiet and whole. He still received the occasional glance, still noticed the lingering hesitation in a few faces, But it didn't matter. They had seen what it meant to stand your ground. And, more importantly, they had seen what happened when the wrong person tried to take it. He didn't think of himself as a symbol. He hadn't set out to challenge anything larger than the fence line around his home. But sometimes resistance wasn't about ideology or rebellion. Sometimes it was about deciding that you wouldn't be moved. Not by pressure, not by politics, not by a smile hiding a weapon. Sometimes it was about holding one square of earth and saying, "This is mine, and I don't owe you permission." And that was enough.